Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar. I'm Scott Southward, the Managing Partner in Eastern Canada for BBD, and I'm very happy to be here today. For me personally, medical cannabis really started hitting my radar at the beginning of last year, and I'm starting to understand why. In September of last year, there were nearly 100,000 Canadians that had obtained prescriptions and registered to buy cannabis with one of the growers licensed by Health Canada. That's a dramatic leap from the 30,000 people that were registered in September of 2015, the year prior. We've been doing some reading in preparation for this webinar, and some have estimated that there's 450,000 Canadians that could be signed up for medical cannabis by 2024. So without question, this is going to raise some questions for employees. This is going to raise questions for employers. And finally, this is going to raise questions for benefit and HR professionals, which is why we are here today. The key things that we hope to achieve today is really to get an increased knowledge of medical cannabis in general. This, particularly for our audience today, is going to allow you to demonstrate your knowledge and your credibility in the field and be prepared for any questions that may come up. Secondly, I think it's important to have an awareness of medical cannabis and how it integrates with the benefits program. The majority of attendees here today will be benefit professionals, and there are some nuances to coverage which we are going to talk more about. And finally, I think it's important to discuss how medical cannabis may impact human resources and other workplace policies, and look at what are some of the duties that employers have surrounding medical cannabis. The idea here is not to become HR professionals ourselves per se, and certainly not by the end of this webinar, but rather to know some of the key questions and considerations. So in order to do that, we've brought in some experts. Tracy McPherson is BBD's Director of HR and is responsible for our own workplace policies. Tracy has background with a variety of organizations, whether they be large or small, union or non-union, or in industries ranging in financial services, such as with ourselves, to heavy manufacturing. Simon Ryers is a regional director with BBD who works with advisors in the Toronto area as well as the Atlantic provinces. In his role, Simon has helped implement plans with a medical cannabis component. So to get started today, let's start with an understanding of the professional comfort level that you feel with this topic. And we're going to just start with a quick poll here. So you'll see the poll question come up on your screen. As an advisor, my current understanding of medical cannabis is A, I am very well informed, B, I am somewhat informed, I know very little, or I know next to nothing. Just wait a little while for some people to lock in their votes. All right, we're going to close it here in the next couple seconds. Perfect. Thanks for everyone who has participated in the poll. So it looks like we've got a lot of people in the middle. For 6% of the people that are well informed, perhaps you guys should be on this side given the webinar. And for the 6% that feel they know next to nothing, you'll probably have lots to gain from the session. And for everybody else, I hope we have some things in here that will help us improve, and we'll check back in on this benchmark at the end of the session. So to try and improve some of these poll numbers, let's start with the help of a story. So let's start by introducing you to Pat and to Sandy. Pat has owned and operated Acme Engineering, his family's national engineering firm, for the past 15 years. Acme has 30 employees that span a variety of roles from engineering consultants to employees on work sites. Sandy, in the green shirt, has been with Acme for 5 years and thinks the world of Acme and the job Pat has done to build the business. Sandy is in many ways Pat's right-hand person and is instrumental in keeping Pat attuned to what is happening in the field. Recently, Sandy has come to Pat and asked about medical cannabis coverage through their benefits plan. He's admittedly a little naive to this whole world, other than reading more and more articles in the papers recently. Also, when Pat last hopped into one of the site bobcats, he noticed an odor of marijuana. However, he could never identify who had used the machine last. Pat has recently come to you as an advisor with some questions. Tracy, perhaps we can expand on some of the things Pat has been reading about in the newspapers, including what is medical cannabis, what is the current legal status of marijuana in Canada, and what are the differences between medical and recreational cannabis?
Sure, Scott. Here's some information that might help. Cannabis is a category for a plant species that includes both marijuana and hemp. The best way to think of it is with an analogy. Hemp and marijuana are to cannabis as lemons and oranges are to citrus, two related plants from the same family. Cannabis contains over 85 cannabinoids, some of which have been found to have therapeutic benefits. The two major cannabinoids that possess the most therapeutic beneficial properties are tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, and cannabidiol, or CBD. THC is the chemical that produces its psychoactive or mind-altering effects. It has been shown to be a mild pain reliever, increase appetite, induce sleep, and affect muscle control problems. CBD is one of the primary compounds extracted from medical cannabis and does not cause a psychoactive effect like THC. It has been shown to relieve convulsions, inflammation, anxiety, cough, congestion, and nausea, and there are indicators that it inhibits cancer cell growth. Cannabis has been around for a very long time and is dated back to the Chinese, with records showing it was used for medicinal purposes. Today, across Canada, it is legal for medicinal purposes and has been since 2001. Marijuana without a prescription, however, remains illegal. So what are the differences between medical and recreational cannabis? Medical cannabis is legal, prescribed through a medical practitioner, and used to treat medical symptoms. Medical cannabis is often administered to patients in alternative ways beyond smoking, including inhalers, capsules, and even edible baked goods. Recreational marijuana is illegal and used to get high, usually through smoking. It is typically the marijuana plant because of its higher level of THC. According to the World Health Organization, marijuana is the most popular recreational drug worldwide, and in Canada is second only to alcohol.
Perfect, thanks Tracy. And I'll leave that slide up there for a quick second because I think that's a pretty necessary distinction. You know, with all the talk in the news these days of, you know, dispensaries being raided by police, particularly in larger cities like Toronto and Vancouver, I think it's important to make note of these differences and know that these are not licensed producers that are distributing medical cannabis. So, that said, surprise, surprise, Pat and Sandy still have some questions. For Pat to consider medical cannabis on his employee benefits plan, he would like to know, could he get coverage, and what does that look like? So, let's poll our audience. So, which of the following is true? Medical cannabis is not eligible for a benefits plan because it is illegal. Medical cannabis is not a medically eligible expense because it does not have a drug identification number. And medical cannabis is a medically eligible expense that can be covered under a benefits plan. We'll give a few more seconds just to lock in your final answers. Okay, fantastic. So that was an interesting poll. We had 67% believe that it is not eligible because it does not have a drug identification number, and we had 33% that believe that it is medically eligible and can be covered under a benefits plan. The answer is, in fact, C. Medical cannabis is a medically eligible expense that can be covered under a benefits plan. But for those that were thinking B, you are right that it does not have a drug identification number, which does, in fact, make it different from a more traditional pharmaceutical prescription. So let's go and dig a little bit deeper into this. Simon, perhaps you can tell us how medical cannabis gets reimbursed in the benefits context.
Absolutely. Thanks, Scott. So when we were first presented with the question about including medical cannabis as a benefit offering, we wanted to see if we could cover the drug on a traditional group health plan. This posed an issue because medical cannabis does not have a drug identification number, or a DIN. Because of the fact that drug formularies rely on a DIN for proper adjudication, we found that a traditional group plan just wasn't going to work. Our next thought was to have the medical cannabis covered through a healthcare spending account, because of the fact that medical cannabis is considered a medically eligible expense according to the CRA. In the benefits world, we generally see HCSAs being used as a top-up to a traditional plan, but they would generally have limits too small to cover the average annual cost of medical cannabis. Healthcare spending accounts are also generally designed to cover all medically eligible expenses outlined by the Canada Revenue Agency. Therefore, increasing the limits on the HCSA to accommodate the cannabis users would have considerable cost consequences because the increase would apply to the entire class of employees. With more healthcare spending account dollars to spend, employees might be inclined to spend on things that the employer does not want to cover, such as designer glasses, for example. It became pretty obvious to us that having an HCSA that covers the usual medical expenses, as well as medical cannabis, could be a financial liability to the employer. Finally, we came up with a solution that made sense. We realized that being a third-party administrator gives us so many options to be flexible and come up with a solution. And in this case, having access to multiple healthcare spending accounts was key. For this particular plan, we had offered the traditional pooled benefits, fully insured health and dental, a top-up healthcare spending account for medically eligible expenses, and then a separate standalone healthcare spending account for medical cannabis claims only.
So, Simon, are you able to expand on how you were able to adjudicate claims that are medical cannabis only?
For sure. The neat thing about our standalone healthcare spending account is that we adjudicate all claims in-house at BBD. So we are really able to customize each account to fit the needs of the group. So in this case, we set parameters around adjudicating claims that are medical cannabis only, as well as only cannabis from a licensed producer called MedRelief. Any other claims that are submitted, such as paramedicals or dental claims, will not be adjudicated through this HCSA. It's also important to note that all employees have access to this medical cannabis spending account, but obviously only those with a medical prescription for cannabis will be able to claim. So for this case, if it was Pat's objective to keep his employees happy, then it looks like this could be a viable solution.
Certainly sounds like Pat's got a lot to think about, but it could be a good fit for his company. Can you give us a bit of a recap about how you came to this solution?
For sure. So as you can see here, going through a traditional health plan wasn't going to work because medical cannabis lacks a drug identification number. So we ruled this option out. For the second option, we looked at a healthcare spending account, but that wasn't going to work because the cost of medical cannabis exceeded the healthcare spending account limit. So then we ruled out option 2 as well. Next, we looked at increasing the limit of the healthcare spending account, but we found that this could be a liability to the employer. Those employees who are not medical cannabis users would have more money in their account than the employer wants to offer for the usual medically eligible expenses. This just wasn't a financially viable option. For option 4, The final solution we came up with was a fully insured plan with a small top-up HCSA for medically eligible expenses. Then we added a larger limit HCSA that we customized to only adjudicate medical cannabis claims.
So you mentioned earlier that the spending account was confined to medical cannabis claims only from a company called MedRelief. Can you give some background on them and why we chose to work with them?
So after some extensive research, we learned that MedRelief was the first ISO-certified cannabis company in North America, and they are the leading licensed producer in Canada. MedRelief is able to connect patients with medical cannabis in a safe, secure, and regulated system. They were also the first licensed provider in Canada to have cannabis available in capsules, which allows for much more consistent dosing. So for all of those reasons, we were happy to set up the healthcare spending account to adjudicate medical cannabis claims for MedRelief Cannabis.
Okay, great. So let's go back to Pat's employees, including Sandy. If we were to implement this plan for Pat's company, how would we communicate this program to employees?
So that wouldn't be an issue at all. Benefits by Design is fully prepared to customize the booklet wording for Pat's company, as well as release customized admin kits to reflect the coverage of medical cannabis on their new plan.
All right. So now let's talk about medical cannabis in the workplace. We've noted that both Pat and Sandy are worried that an employee may be impaired while at work or be high on the job. But first, let's go to another poll question. So do I have to accommodate an employee that has been prescribed medical cannabis? Yes, no, I don't know. Okay, fantastic. So the results are in. If this was Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and you had said ask the audience would not have let you down. There was 48% that said yes, 22% said no, and 30% said they were unsure. So in fact, the answer is yes. The duty to accommodate extends to disabled employees who use medical cannabis. Pat must accommodate an employee prescribed medical cannabis in the same way he would accommodate any other disabled employee who has been prescribed medication. Tracy, can you expand?
Sure, Scott. Pat's concerns represent many employers today around their responsibilities. For most employers, when they first hear about medical cannabis in the workplace, they think of their employee getting high and not being able to perform their job. This is not always the case. There are many different strains which don't cause impairment at all, and depending on what is being treated, it isn't a requirement that cannabis can be used during the daytime or during work hours. There are two obligations or duties that Pat and other employers should understand. The duty to accommodate, which is legislated under federal and provincial human rights, and the duty to have a safe workplace under provincial occupational health and safety. The duty to accommodate means an employer must try to remove barriers that prevent an employee from performing their essential duties of the job. Every employer has a legal duty to accommodate an employee short of undue hardship, like the cost to accommodate is more expensive than having something else in place. Employers are required to provide reasonable accommodation to an employee with a disability or medication taken due to that disability. This is not to say, however, that the duty to accommodate is limitless. Employers cannot dismiss requests for accommodation out of hand and must follow a due diligence process. The second duty, to have a safe workplace, means Pat and other employers must provide a workplace that is safe for all employees. They must take every precaution reasonable given the circumstances to ensure the protection of their workers. Providing a safe workplace rests solely on the employer to ensure.
So how does this look in the context of medical cannabis, Tracy?
Well, Scott, when an employee discloses they have been prescribed medical cannabis, it triggers a process for accommodation to occur. Employers should know that a prescription for medical cannabis does not entitle an employee to be impaired at work. It does not entitle an employee to compromise his or her safety or the safety of others. It does not entitle an employee to smoke in the workplace. Anti-smoking laws apply to smoking marijuana in the same way they do to regular cigarettes. And it does not entitle an employee to inexcused absences or late arrivals. What it does do is require the employer, or PAT in this case, to attempt to find suitable accommodated work for the employee, just as you would in accommodating an employee for any other illness, disability, or drug prescribed to treat a disability. So for an accommodation process, PAT or representative of the company being informed of the prescription triggers the process to start. This process is a shared obligation between PAT and the employee. It is the responsibility of the employee requiring accommodation to make the accommodation request. PAT then initiates the accommodation analysis process promptly after receiving the employee's request. This will include a request for documentation on limitations to performing the role, usually obtained by the employee through their medical practitioner. PAT will work with the employee to assess limitations and options available for accommodation. They will consider things like the current type of work he's doing, the needs of the company, and the needs of the employee. There are many options that can be considered when trying to accommodate an employee. Some options may be modified or shuffled duties, especially if this employee is in a safety-sensitive position, modified hours or altered shift schedules, providing more frequent breaks, telecommunicating or working from home, providing assistive equipment such as a different type of keyboard or chair, and it could also be a leave of absence if no true accommodation is available at the time.
So I get there's a lot to think about here, Tracy. Should PAT or an employer in PAT's situation have a specific policy on medical marijuana?
Well, there's no need to write a separate policy. If you currently have a drug and alcohol policy in place, then just update to address medical cannabis similar to other prescription medication in the workplace. If you don't have one, then you should consider having one written. It is important that the policy effectively and precisely communicate the employee's entitlements and obligations with regards to using or being under the influence of medical cannabis. Terms such as impairment and under the influence should be specifically defined so employees understand whether or not they fall under the scope of the policy. Employers should communicate what, if any, uses of medical cannabis will be considered acceptable in the workplace, the appropriate procedure for reporting the use of medical cannabis, and developing a common accommodation process so it can be used for more than just the medical cannabis. The policy should also address the disciplinary consequences of breaching this policy or its reporting protocols. All employees should be made aware of the policy and have them sign off on it. When writing a policy, remember that enforcing zero tolerance in the workplace for cannabis use or possession is becoming harder due to the increase in prescriptions allowed.
So, I remember Pat and his concern of the bobcat and that particular smell. Well, meet Sam. He works for Pat in the field and operates a bobcat from time to time. He has been prescribed medical marijuana to relieve severe stomach pain. He has not informed Pat or his manager for fear of being terminated. Sam is concerned that he will lose his job if he informs them. Does he have to inform his manager, Tracy?
Sam's concerns regarding the potential loss of employment are understandable. Sam doesn't have to let them know he is using medical cannabis, especially if he isn't using during work hours. However, generally medical cannabis consumption required during work hours should be disclosed to an employer as soon as possible, especially if operating any safety-sensitive equipment such as a bobcat. Concealing it may lead to termination, especially if an incident happens or a policy is in place and they've gone against it. The use of medical cannabis, when duly prescribed by a physician, is considered like any other prescription drug. It triggers a duty to accommodate in application of the human rights legislation which protects employees from discrimination. If an employer is not aware of the employee's condition, the right to an accommodation may be forfeited. Furthermore, an employee may be pursuing work activities that aren't compatible with the residual effects of cannabis consumption, hence endangering himself or herself and others in the area. This is where having a policy in place outlining the process and protections of both Sam and Pat's company is important.
Great, Tracy. Well, I think we've probably covered a fair amount of ground today with Pat and Sandy. Let's check in with a final poll here to see if we've improved on our first question. So, as an advisor, my current understanding of medical cannabis is we're going to give it a few more seconds. I will note that no one has said they know nothing at this point in time, so that's got to bode well for us in some capacity. All right, fantastic. So we've seen a marked improvement in a quick discussion here on particularly medical cannabis in general, how it works and can interact with the benefits plan, and some of the HR and workplace policies and how we might interact with that in the workplace. We're now going to open up the webinar for questions. However, in doing so, would like to first thank all of the attendees. As advisors, I know you guys have many demands on your time and take on an awful lot of responsibility helping your clients, certainly making informed decisions. We hope this helps you to be a continued credible resource and help you to attract even more prospects and clients drawn to your advice. And certainly we think having some of this information will give you an opportunity to be able to ask some questions that will get employers thinking about some of these things and proactively taking some steps to make sure they're aware of this stuff. Lastly, would like to thank Tracy and Simon for being our experts today, and for our communications team, and in particular Jessica Bredschneider, for all of the work that she does behind the scenes to make these webinars a reality. So, questions. And I think we've got a chat bar here with some questions running up. Oh. Move you closer to the mic. Here we go. All right, we've got a question. I have an employee trying to claim cannabis on their plan. How can I ensure that it is medical cannabis versus marijuana?
I can take that one, Scott. So the first thing I would say is that the great thing about our standalone health spending accounts is that BBD adjudicates all claims in-house. So we would definitely make the measures to make sure that the claim is from a legal licensed provider. And I would say if the employer is still concerned, I would let them know that these accounts are very customizable. So we can set restrictions around the adjudication of specific licensed providers. So I would tie that back to our example of MedRelief.
Great. All right, we've got a question here. Is medical cannabis permitted through the HCSA only for disabled employees, as you mentioned, or can it be for any employees actively at work?
For that, I would say that if you have a prescription, so you have to get some medical practitioner to give it to you. If you've got a prescription, then I would say absolutely it would be able to be put through your HCSA, and if it's approved through adjudication, then it would be there.
Yeah, and I would agree, and I'd say in some of our case studies, they're definitely designed for employees that are actively at work. So thank you for the question. Let's see here. So we just had an admin question. Can we get a PowerPoint and the scripting to review, since some of the words were difficult to understand? So apologies if some of the words were difficult, and certainly we'd be more than happy to share the PowerPoint and answer any questions that come up afterwards. All right. We got a question. What diseases does medical cannabis typically get prescribed for?
Typical things would be HIV, cancer, Crohn's, epilepsy, multiple sclerosis, pain management, nausea, that again can be related to cancer and HIV treatments. There's quite a list, and it continues to grow. There's even things where they're doing studies around concussions with athletes and how it can help with brain injuries. So lots of stuff is starting to happen.
Yeah, and I think I just add, certainly would definitely recommend, if you're concerned or thinking about some of those things, to yourself, or if you're talking to someone, have them consult their medical practitioner for more on that. Okay, will employees be required to submit a prescription with each claim, or will there be an assumption that anything submitted will go through? So they would submit a claim in the same way that they would submit any other claim to their healthcare spending account. So it would be the employee would depending on the adjudication mechanism, they might take a picture of their claim, or they might submit the information, and they maybe ask for providing the receipt at some later date. But it would just depend on the adjudication mechanism. What does Pat mean again? Oh, Pat was our employer, our dear employer. Does not mean pass attempts for any football fans out there. So we've got a question. Why have clients to date added the dedicated medical cannabis healthcare spending account? Is it due to just being proactive, or due to employee input? If a client brings this up and asks, why should we add this, how would you respond? So I think that's a good question. So we've added more than one of these things, and the reasons and rationale do vary. Sometimes it has been certainly wanting to cover it for their employees. So whether they know certain employees that they know would appreciate it, or they think of it as a benefit. Other times it's been the philosophy of the employer themselves, thinking that they would like to give their employees access to this in the same way that they would, through a traditional fully insured plan, give access to their employees and their dependents with that coverage. So I think it does depend. In terms of if a client brings us up and asks, should we add this, how would you respond? I think one of the primary reasons for putting on a webinar similar to this is to start getting familiar with the content and the information. Really, the ultimate thing is for having the conversation and then allowing every employer to be able to make an informed decision. So I don't want to suggest that medical cannabis is going to be right for every single employer in every single situation and every single employee with every single illness, nor would I suggest that it's not going to work for anyone. I think there is certainly going to be opportunities here, and being able to make an informed decision based on the facts is an important one. So I think there's a lot of things out there that would be considered noise, in my opinion. You know, you hear things about raids happening in newspapers and recreational cannabis, and will it become decriminalized or legalized and all these sorts of things. I think it's important to separate that from the discussion that we're having in a workplace context, which is truly medical cannabis distributed by licensed producers that are regulated heavily by Health Canada, and start talking about how that fits with a benefits plan and how that fits with your HR and your work policies. So I hope that answers some of the questions. Just one caveat I'll throw out for everyone. Certainly, you've seen some of the pictures of the experts on here, but if there's any questions, we're more than happy afterwards to have some more dialogue and make sure that you've got your questions answered as well. Okay, so here we've got a question. Will claims only be approved if submitted via MedRelief?
I can take that one, Scott. So we were presented with the case earlier this year, and that is what the employer wanted. They only wanted to approve claims through MedRelief. So, like I said, through our standalone health spending accounts, we were able to customize that, but that was unique for that employer in that situation. So we're happy to look at different situations and different groups, and we're able to customize it to their liking.
Great. And I'll just add to that. I mean, certainly there's a number of licensed producers out there. I think there's now 38 at last check. Some of the things that Simon mentioned in the presentation, they're being the first ones to be ISO certified, some of the stuff that they're doing with capsules, the amount that they invest in research and development and technology around and quality control is as we've gotten to know them more is something that we've certainly really found to be something that we appreciate, and they've been very credible in terms of this landscape, which is moving quite quickly. So here's a question: where can I find more information about licensed producers like MedRelief? Certainly, I would say that feel free to reach out to one of us that was on the webinar, and also there's some great resources just on the Health Canada website, and maybe we'll get, as a follow-up to this when we share the slide presentation and that as well, a link to Health Canada, and you can poke around on there, and then certainly online, MedRelief's website, you'll be able to grab some information there as well. Can you share average utilization percentage in medical cannabis HCSA to date? I don't know exactly the question around utilization, whether it's the number of employees that you're asking about. If that's the case, it's too early to tell for us in terms of average utilization. I can tell you, if you're wondering sort of average cost per claimant, there is some information that's also on Health Canada's website, and they do it by grams and what the average gram intake per consumer would be. And if you take that and the average cost, it works out to the average medical cannabis user would be around, I think, $1,900 to $2,200 of sort of average annual spend, to give you some context. So hopefully that's helpful. But for more specific details, certainly feel free to follow up. We'll be happy to try and get those answers for you. Do we forecast a DIN number being assigned to medical marijuana in the future? Another good question, and I would say that if I were to forecast, I would say yes. I think one of the things that we're seeing from a technology standpoint is, and MedRelief was actually the first to come out with this, which is it being medical cannabis being delivered through various other mechanisms, including capsules and oils and things like that. That certainly helps to control the dosage and things like that, and I could see that certainly going through approval and getting a drug identification number. At this point in time, in the absence of that, knowing that there's still employees that would want access to it, as we've seen from the growth to date, knowing that there's employers who may want to provide access to it, that's where some of these solutions have proven to be useful. Okay, we've got a question here. So if someone is on disability, they cannot claim cannabis. And I guess the answer to that is if they have benefits coverage while they're on disability, so if their health and dental has been extended while they're on disability, then they would be able to, in the same way that an employee who is actively at work would be able to as well. All right. Does BBD not believe the medical and safety downsides not outweigh the negatives of the unproven medical studies and the potential for overuse abuse? It sounds like a miracle. It sounds like a miracle drug under the guise of getting high. I would say, first of all, thank you for the question, because I think it certainly is something that is going to come across in a lot of people's minds and is worth having a discussion on. You know, I think that there are still some unknowns in terms of, you know, let's take, for example, if you were to be a medical cannabis user, what does that mean in terms of your average spend for things like other pharmaceutical prescriptions and things of that nature? So I really think going back to our philosophy is really to provide information that's going to help you make informed decisions. Not to suggest that this is a miracle, nor to suggest this is something that's not worth any consideration. I think it's going to depend on a number of different factors: the interests of the employers and the employees, some certainly how it's worked with other people, and then certainly medical research, and that continues to grow that body of work over time. But thank you for the question. Oops, sorry. We've got. Thanks. I thought it was a policy to accommodate. I was writing notes, so maybe that's asking for a clarification on, is it in fact a duty to accommodate? So I will say that the answer to that is yes. The duty to accommodate extends to employees who use medical cannabis. So Pat must accommodate in that case, or any employer for that matter would have to accommodate an employee that is prescribed medical cannabis. Certainly for any additional information, I know Tracy went through a lot of things as to what does accommodation mean, what is that duty and stuff like that, then certainly we can circle back on that. So we've got, would my medical practitioner recommend a licensed producer, and if not, where could I find a list? Another good question. I would say that it will probably depend on your medical practitioner and whether or not they're familiar with a licensed producer. If not, then Health Canada certainly has a list of all licensed producers, and you could certainly, through some research there, be able to find that.
So the question is, do we have a sample of a policy including the use of medical marijuana? So yes, as we were also looking into this, we've updated and created our own alcohol and drug policy, and for sure we can share it with you. But I just want to make sure everybody does realize that everybody will have their own nuances onto what that policy looks like. So definitely we can share for you to have a look at, but just don't forget that your culture and what owners are going to allow or not allow could be different from one company to the next.
Oprah, I think this was a clarification question on, I'm asking utilization so we can advise on budgeting, from Kevin. So Kevin, in terms of budgeting, again, the average annual cost, I can get you those figures, was I think $1,900 to $2,200 per user. We'd have to look into it. I don't know if we have great data at this point in time around sort of the, let's say, percentage of the population that would be using medical cannabis, other than perhaps the figures that we referenced at the beginning of the call, which is to say, in fall of last year, there was approximately 100,000 Canadians that were listed prescribed medical cannabis users. So if you sort of run the math back, that's threefold over where it was in 2015, but still would represent a relatively small percentage of the population. So I hope that's helpful. If not, please try and circle back and see if we can help further. Here's a question saying, I would be concerned that costs could start to spiral. And certainly, you know, there's going to be a cost with some of these things. I mean, one of the nice things about having it as part of a healthcare spending account is you could still put a limit on it that may even be below the average annual cost. So in that case, you would be, in a sense, it's almost like putting in a plan that has a drug max to it. You know, certainly we have seen that that the number of prescribed users has been increasing, so there is something to consider there. And I think it's still early days to determine what impact this may have. So certainly people may use it, and they may use it in lieu of using other medications, things like opioids and things like that. Or in other situations, it may, as you've noted, just end up as an added cost. So I think it's worth the question. I don't pretend to have all the answers at this point in time, but I think it's still worth the conversation. All right, we've got, will this webinar be available online? And we have done a recording of it, and I believe it will be online. So, yes. Answer that question already. Okay, great. So that's all the questions we've been asked. Once again, thank you guys for your time and interest in this topic. If there's anything that we can do to help further, please let us know. And all the best as you answer some of these questions and have some of these conversations. Take care.